the end? Is this the end? I'm burning in the stone. There's no place to hide. I'm burning in the stone. This is the final time. What have we done to the world? What have we done to the world? I'm burning in the stone. There's no place to hide. I'm burning in the stone. This is the final
Hey everyone, happy Monday. Welcome to The Cult. The Cult is a show that I stream Monday through Friday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on Rumble, on YouTube, on X, maybe some other places too if I'm really on my game, where we talk about all aspects of the culture war and basically whatever I feel like talking about at any given time. And we've got a wonderful guest coming on today. Very timely guest, I have to say. And well, you know, you might have some issues today, but you're welcome to ask him questions. I know he's going to do a great job. But before I bring him on, I do just want to do a quick couple of plugs for things that I've got up on the Substack and stuff like that. Now, as you guys know, James Lindsay has been having a hissy fit about me all weekend. He keeps posting about how I have a personality disorder. James Lindsay literally earlier today tweeted that the only reason I have intellectual critiques of his work is because I want to fuck him. I'm not kidding. You can see that in this article I posted last night, where I have the receipts of all of the bullshit that James has been doing over the past several months. And literally one of those receipts is from this morning. I updated the article because someone retweeted James and says, besides Carlin being a psycho, I think she secretly wants you. And James says it's not even secret. So you can judge for yourself there, but in this article, and this is actually the most important thing, I want everyone to know that I'm now sick of James Lindsay's shit. And I'm formally challenging him to a public debate. And we're not going to go into this like in any great depth, but I have intellectual criticisms of James Lindsay's work that you can find in this article. I enumerated them specifically. Here are my top 4 intellectual criticisms of James Lindsay's work. God knows I have more than 4 criticisms of his work, but that's what we're going to go with right now. And I'm formally challenging him to a public debate, and I want us to start steering our pressure campaign against James to this effect. Because here's the thing. James can claim I have narcissistic personality disorder, which I don't. He can claim I have borderline personality disorder, which I don't. He can claim that I am, I don't even know, like, all the other things he's like, you can go in the article and see, he can claim that I just want to fuck him, which I don't. Like, you can see, he can cry about my friendship with Nick Fuentes and the Groypers all he wants. He's doing all this stuff, but one of the things that James has never, ever done is answer any of the very clear and very valid intellectual criticisms I have of his work. And so now we are going to gear our pressure campaign to James around, you got to show up, bro, because listen, you're supposed to be a PhD. I'm actually a PhD in real life. We are supposed to be able to have an intellectual conversation, and if James refuses to have an intellectual conversation, then I will just, make it clear that there is one of us who wants to engage in an intellectual dialogue. There's one of us that wants to run around Twitter acting like a crazy person. And earlier today, I did actually have an amazing Twitter space where I did a whole breakdown, and you can find this currently on Twitter. You can also find it on the YouTube channel as well, because I simulcasted it to YouTube. I probably should have had this up. This will be going in the Actively Unwoke podcast. I'll talk about that in a second. But we had a live discussion on X earlier about specifically my number one grievance of James, which is he is not clear about the real goal of the woke left. And so what I did is I held a 2.5-hour Twitter space and I explained it clearly, in depth. I gave people resources, and then we had a wonderful conversation. If you missed that Twitter space, this is something I'm going to be doing an awful lot moving forward. And we're also going to be adding that to the Actively Unwoke podcast, which if you guys are not subscribed to that, you can find it over on the Substack. You can also find it on Apple Podcasts. You can find it on Spotify. If you listen to the Actively Unwoke podcast on either of those platforms, please feel free to give me a 5-star rating. Let's start boosting up the podcast, because God knows we've got a lot of things to teach people if James isn't going to do it. Mac B says he should go bite rocks. I agree, Mac B. I agree. But you know what? We're going to talk more about James in another time, because I really want to get right into my guest, because the timing of this is absolutely perfect. And you know what's funny is he was actually supposed to come on the channel last Monday, and I kind of DM'd him. I was like, can I push you off a week? And the reason for that, it wasn't anything to do with him. It was that I wanted to really do a whole week on queer Marxism, and it was like Monday was when it was scheduled. I was like, oh, I want my full queer Marxism week. But then later in the week, that ended up getting shelved anyway. But the good news is that last week there was this giant meltdown of the conservative influencers, or the classical liberal influencers, where they're all talking about people are woke right if they don't like Winston Churchill and like all this stuff. So I actually think this worked out beautifully. Today we're going to be joined by one of my favorite people. He is just one of the smartest people I know. He is the managing editor for the Libertarian Institute. His name is Keith Knight. He has been on the channel before, and Keith has an article up over on the Libertarian Institute, and I will put this in the chat so you guys can have it up here. He is going to talk to us about, was Winston Churchill really a hero, or maybe is there more to the story of this? And I swear, this happened before the woke right Daryl Cooper meltdown. We were going to do this anyway, and I was just like, this is fate. This is the universe smiling at us and telling us this is the exact moment we should have this conversation. So I am so excited to welcome him to the channel. He's been on the channel before, and I think you guys are going to love him. And please, give him a warm round of applause in the chat. Mr. Keith Knight, welcome back to the channel. How are you?
Carlin, I am doing excellent. It is so good to be back. It really brings me back to when I first read Actively Unwoke, how excellent your contributions are. I'm sorry, I didn't know that you and James Lindsay were in a spat. I'll have to look into the details on that, but excellent to see you. Thank you again for having me on.
Hey, I really appreciate it. Well, did you know that, so I know you're a fan of, Dave Smith, right? Because most of the libertarians are. So according to James Lindsay, Dave Smith is part of the woke right because he is supporting Candace Owens. He's called him out by name a couple times. And so congratulations, Dave Smith is now on the woke right as well, according to James.
I would love to get a definition of woke right from James before I make a verdict on whether he's completely full of shit or just partially full of shit on that one.
Hey, so we'll put it James doesn't need any more attention. We can talk about other things. So I mean, what have you been thinking about? So did you watch the interview with Tucker Carlson and Daryl Cooper, and what were your thoughts on that?
So originally on YouTube, I saw the title of a video that said how Winston Churchill ruined Europe. And I was so shocked to see this on YouTube, even more shocked to see that it was uploaded by Tucker Carlson and the podcaster historian Daryl Cooper. The reason this is so important is because in the last 2 years, since February of 2022, when Russia went into Ukraine, and especially since after October 7th of last year, every single time there is a discussion on the moral justification of the actions of our allies, Vladimir Zelensky or the Israeli Defense Forces, every single debate with zero exceptions has brought up the Second World War. This myth of the Second World War, this creation of the prevailing interpretation of past events, is what allows people to say, good guy, Zelensky, good guy, Churchill, good guy, Netanyahu. Yeah, Netanyahu's the Churchill of today. Well, I agree with that, but for very different reasons than people may think. Putin, well, Putin's a bad guy. You know who else was a bad guy? The head of the German Workers' National Socialist Party, Adolf Hitler. So instead of bearing the opportunity cost of finding out the details, the costs and benefits of these military conflicts, people will put the Churchill stamp on the good guy and put the evil Hitler stamp on the bad guy without even knowing that this historical narrative is completely mythical when it comes to the concept of it's good countries versus bad countries. I will concede that this is a battle. The Second World War was a battle of good versus evil. It was evil politicians versus the good people in all countries. That's my general thesis. That's why this is so important today. So this myth cannot be used to manipulate us into going to war with China over Taiwan or going to war with Russia over Ukraine.
Awesome. That's a great way to start us out. Elena says, did I start something? Elena is in the UK. She's been doing her own research into Churchill lately, and so she probably is going to have some opinions on that in the chat as well. And I really want to emphasize this point. I mean, like, listen, I obviously have been through a little bit of an ideological evolution lately, and, I don't need everyone to agree with me, and we do disagree on things. And the thing of it is a lot of people are saying right now, if you are saying that maybe Winston Churchill wasn't actually this mythical hero, they're actually saying that's like anti-Semitic or things like that, but you are fully on like the side of Israel, like in this conflict between them and is that an accurate statement?
I'm on the side of civilians in Palestine and civilians in Israel,
Hey.
but Benjamin Netanyahu's an evil mass murderer.
Okay.
So
I
no,
misunderstood that. Apologies.
Oh, no, I'm saying the way that the myths are sold to us today is Netanyahu is the Churchill of our day. And just as we would have been behind Churchill 70 years ago, we got to back Netanyahu today. He's fighting in this war against evil. Every single Israel-Palestine debate, the Second World War gets mentioned for a reason.
Yeah.
It's the myth they use to justify further mass murder campaigns in the present. That's why this is really striking at the root of the empire. That's why the neocons and a lot of Republicans flip out just at questioning this narrative. So I'm sorry I didn't make that clear.
Oh, no, that might have been my misunderstanding. I apologize. It's been a busy day already, so I appreciate the clarification. But no, I mean, I do think this is really important to say, because I think it's one of those things where, like, you I think are on the side of just like normal average people that like aren't involved in this conflict at all. And obviously there's a lot of like over 40,000 people in Palestine have been killed as a result of this conflict. And of course there have been 1,200 people on October 7th in Israel that have been killed as well. We don't like want any of that either. But it's one of those things where I feel like everyone has kind of dug in their heels and they're saying like you keep saying it's black and white. It is good or bad, and there's no kind of like in between to it. And I think that this example of Churchill is, I don't know if you've seen this, but like in culture, like, I mean, this has certainly happened with me in my community. We've been going back and revisiting, World War II and watching different perspectives on it. And we recently watched a video about, it was about a lot of things that happened to like the German people after World War II. But one of those things was the firebombing of Dresden and things like that, and a lot of like the needless suffering that was created, like with Winston Churchill kind of at the center of this whole affair.
So to the question, was Winston Churchill evil? This article that you had on the screen, I go through a series of exhibits, and I want to start one by one. Here is Winston Churchill's original position as First Lord of the Admiralty in the First World War. Here is what Winston Churchill wrote in his own book titled The World Crisis, 1911 to 1918. As First Lord of the Admiralty, he's calling the shots for the Navy. Churchill says, "The British blockade treated the whole of Germany as if it were a beleaguered fortress and avowedly sought to starve the whole population, men, women, and children, old and young, wounded and sound, into submission." Notice it wasn't him saying, we did this so we could kill Kaiser Wilhelm, the guy who was, the head of the military of Germany. We are the good guys. We discriminate between guilty parties and innocent people. He said, this is a war against the German population. I actually had to buy a copy of that book because I did not think this quote was real. But the link, the citation I use in the article will take you to the exact page. I think it's 672 in his book. So this alone was estimated by Martin Gilbert, who's a very pro-Churchill historian, 762,000 German deaths as a cause result of this starvation blockade. Today, it's widely recognized if China forms a blockade around Taiwan, that's an act of war, and the U.S. will go to war with nuclear China over such an action. Well, Winston Churchill openly engaged in this and made millions of people suffer, killing roughly 760,000. This is the first act of evil which we could really pin on Churchill. His unwillingness to discriminate between guilty and innocent parties. Realize Henry Asquith, the Prime Minister of Britain, declared war against Germany. This would have been in August of 1914 because they passed through Belgium during their invasion of France. This went back to an 1839 agreement that Britain had with Belgium that if their independence were ever violated, Britain would declare war on their behalf. So a law from 100 years ago justified a mass murder campaign that involved conscripts enslaving people to fight in this war just to protect the people of France. The First World War ended with 1.3 million dead Frenchmen and French cities just torched to the ground. That's what you get with war guarantees. So Ben Shapiro and Dennis Prager are not great tough guys when they're saying, we want to give Ukraine a war guarantee. Well, Ukraine is having to bear the cost for that because Russia sees it as in being a violation of their sphere of influence. Just as John F. Kennedy would not have allowed nukes in Cuba, the Russians are not allowing NATO to join Ukraine. You're not a nice guy if you're saying the U.S. should defend Taiwan against China. You're actually provoking a war with a nuclear power, which will get those very people killed. The Second World War Declaration by Neville Chamberlain on September 3rd of 1939, the National Socialists invade a city called Danzig, Poland, and as it's referred to as the Polish War Guarantee. Neville Chamberlain says if Hitler goes into Poland, we're going to declare war against Germany. Well, the city he entered was called Danzig, which according to Encyclopedia Britannica was 95% German. It was formerly a German city before the Treaty of Versailles. This was worth declaring war and enslaving men ages 18 to 41 into fighting against the National Socialists in Germany. And what happened to Poland? This kind, virtuous favor led to the death of 7 million Poles. And after the war, Poland was under the occupation of the Soviet Empire. It wasn't even a real war guarantee because the Soviets invaded on September 17th of 1939, and there was no declaration of war against the Soviets. One thing Churchill said after the end of the Second World War, this is in a book titled The Gathering Storm, published in 1948. Churchill's own words says, the human tragedy reaches its climax in the fact that after all the exertions and sacrifices of hundreds of millions of people and the victories of the righteous cause, we have still not found peace or security, and that we lie in the grip of even worse perils than those we have surmounted. What he's referring to is, let me see, here is President Eisenhower's book, where he shows you how the communists won the Second World War. This is communist occupation from East Germany to Vladivostok, plus China, while they were sending arms to Mao Zedong, plus North Korea, plus Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia under Ho Chi Minh at the time. Not to mention all the Marxists in American universities who, of course, just looking into them, Joseph McCarthy was the most evil man who ever lived. So, this is the reality of the Second World War. It involved allying with Joseph Stalin, and today they tell us we can't talk to Vladimir Putin. Churchill's own words says, we lie in the grip of even worse perils than those we have surmounted. By taking down the biggest bulwark against communism, you gave half of Europe to the communists.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the things. Like, so I was never really into world history, if I'm honest about it. Like thinking about military history and wars and all that stuff kind of like didn't interest me at all. I don't know why my camera's now freezing. Of course, something always has to go wrong when I'm talking on the internet. Let's give that a second to cut. Okay, I think I'm back. So I was never like in school. I was like world history was never my thing. I loved American history. I loved like learning about the Revolutionary War and the Civil War and all that stuff. But like I kind of glazed over World War II, and I've recently been like revisiting it, and I've really been trying to look at just a variety of sources. So not all far right perspectives, not all far left, not any one source of information, because I feel like we exist in this world now where everyone is lying about everything and everyone is twisting everything. And it's like if you don't look at a variety of sources of information, you're never going to get anywhere close to like what the truth actually is. And I don't know why this didn't even occur to me up until I started kind of thinking about it, but the United States literally allied with communists. Like they and it just like it's I feel like that's that one simple fact, because is just so routinely overlooked. And I think you just laid out like the consequences of that, and not just the United States, but the United Kingdom and all this stuff too. It's like, it's mind-boggling to think about. We literally took the side of the communists. Now, my argument is not that we should have been on the side of Germany either. My argument is that we should have stayed out of it entirely, which is usually the correct decision. It's also what we should have done with Ukraine. It's what we should do with the Middle East. We should just be not involved in it at all. Am I right about that?
Absolutely right. I'm happy to get into the U.S. involvement. In fact, let's actually do that. So this is generally referred to as, well, Pearl Harbor was what made it inevitable that the U.S. enters the Second World War. It turns out, well, Hawaii was not a state until 1959. But even if you say, if American troops are attacked, they must declare war against everyone in this country, even if only a few members of the political class conspire to murder Americans. Here is a conversation between Winston Churchill and President Roosevelt. This would have been in August of 1941. This is according to the New York Times on January 2nd, 1972. The article's titled "War Entry Plans Laid to Roosevelt." Here's what Churchill said about Roosevelt. President told the Prime Minister, Churchill, in August of 41, he was looking for an incident to justify opening hostilities against Nazi Germany. Here are Churchill's quotes. He obviously was determined that they should come in. If he were to put the issue of peace and war to Congress, they would debate it for months. The president said he would wage war, but not declare it, and that he would become more and more provocative. If the Germans didn't like it, they could attack American forces. The president ordered these U.S. Navy escorts to attack any German U-boat which showed itself, even if it were 200 or 300 miles away from the convoy. Everything was to be done to force an incident. The president had taken this very well and made it clear that he would look for an incident which would justify him in opening hostilities. So there was a plan to provoke a war with the Axis powers. Later on, Henry Stimson wrote in his diary. Henry Stimson was the Secretary of War at the time, and I want to get this exact quote right. He said, "The president brought up, November 25th, the event that we were likely to be attacked perhaps as soon as next Monday, for the Japanese are notorious for making an attack without warning. And the question was what we should do. The question was how we should maneuver them into the position of firing the first shot without allowing too much danger to ourselves." On December 7th, Stimson writes in his diary, "When the news first came that Japan had attacked us, my first feeling was of relief, that the indecision was over and that a crisis had come in a way which would unite all our people."
Wow.
This was Roosevelt's motivation for provoking an attack with either Japan or Germany. "This continued to be my dominant feeling in spite of the news of catastrophes which quickly developed, for I feel this country united has practically nothing to fear, while the apathy and division stirred up by unpatriotic men have been hitherto discouraging." The final piece of evidence, this wasn't released until 1999. This document, titled the McCullum Memo, was released by a naval researcher. His name is Robert Stinnett, in a book titled Day of Deceit. This is a memo written on October 7th of 1940. So this provocation had been in plan for more than a year. So the idea that, well, if there was, some conspiracy, it would have been exposed by now. The Pearl Harbor myth was under wraps for more than half a century. So yes, this stuff can be kept secret. So the memo was titled "Estimates of the Situation in the Pacific and Recommendations for Action by the United States," saying, here's what I recommend we do. "It is not believed that the present state of political opinion in the United States is capable of declaring war against Japan without more ado, and it's barely possible that vigorous action on our part might lead the Japanese to modify their attitude. Therefore, the following course of action is suggested. Make an arrangement with Britain for the use of British bases in the Pacific, particularly Singapore. Make an arrangement with Holland for the use of base facilities and acquisition of supplies in the Dutch East Indies. Give all possible aid to the Chinese government of Chiang Kai-shek. All of these things actually ended up happening. This wasn't just, well, some kook wrote this down. All of these things came to fruition between when the memo was written and Roosevelt's declaration of war. This would have been, I guess, December 8th of 41. The memo goes on to say, completely embargo all U.S. trade with Japan in collaboration with a similar embargo imposed by the British Empire. This was the Export Control Act of July 26th of 1940. So all of these things came to fruition. Now, this memo is very clear evidence that the deep state at the time was using it as a way to provoke an incident with Japan because Americans were not going to go into a Second World War. The First World War, which was also based on the Lusitania deception, this was an armed merchant ship off the coast of Ireland, which the Germans attacked. In the First World War, 116,000 Americans were killed, and the U.S. didn't enter until April of 1917, 3 years after the war had started. So people were very weary. So they had to provoke this incident at Pearl Harbor to justify U.S. entrance into the war. It is not the case that, well, we tried to stay out, but we were attacked out of nowhere. Again, it was state intervention because governments with access to a central bank, the right to tax, the right to conscript, the legal double standard on they can commit murder and not get charged with murder. They just call it foreign policy, and the fact that they control compulsory education. This makes it much more likely for them to go to war than any other organization. They have every incentive to get people to get their limbs blown off. And then decades later, when you question it, they call you an evil anti-Semite because we have primary documents. We're conspiracy theorists because we have primary documents. They, on the other hand, are like, well, I have a feeling that Hitler was going to take over the entire world, a feat that's never been done, many times attempted. They just have theories. We have primary documents. So I will also link this article on the Pearl Harbor myth from the Libertarian Institute, which I wrote. I titled it Justifying Evil, Pearl Harbor, and the Hiroshima Myth.
Awesome. And I'll go ahead and put that in the chat. And I did put his earlier article in there about Churchill guys in the chat if you want to take a look at that. Let me just get this to load for a second. I mean, it really is like bizarre. And one of the things that I've really kind of like come to understand about primary sources is they're a little tricky because primary sources don't make great clickbait content on the internet. And so it's kind of like, this is like, because I do the same thing with the far left, right? I just watch their videos. Literally, I'd use primary source evidence. That's all. Like, I will not look at anything that's not primary source evidence, but that doesn't make for great clickbait content on the internet. And so it's very easy for people to like ignore this information. But one of the things I always try to like emphasize is like anything in the world you can find primary sources for. And if you just go to the primary sources, you can usually suss out what happened. And maybe some of it's hidden and maybe some of it's hard to find, but like stop listening to people who are editorializing based on a political narrative that they're trying to sell for whatever team they're playing for. Just go to the documents and read them, and the documents will say what the documents say, right?
Exactly. You have to ask if the document is genuine because there are a lot of fakes out there. I waited probably 3 years before ever publishing the McCullum memo on the Libertarian Institute because I'm like, this is pretty damning. It's someone who's in a position to know saying, here's what we can do a year before they actually do the things which caused the thing they intended to, which caused the incident they intended to provoke. There is no innocent explanation for any of this. And even so, you'd think that with all the propaganda we hear about governments here to keep us safe, you would think that the politicians would apologize or something like that if they were just so innocent. They're like, oh, you've paid all these taxes to be safe and we haven't kept you safe, our most fundamental duty. Well, you guys don't have to pay income tax this year since we didn't hold up our end of the bargain of the social contract. You never get that. They're saying, well, we failed at our duty, so now we get more money and more power and we get to kill people with impunity. That's what happens. Consider what the reality of what they really got pissed off about Daryl Cooper for is the unequivocal fact that it was Winston Churchill who initiated the terror bombing of civilians. Neville
Yeah.
Chamberlain stepped down after a debacle off the coast of Norway, and Winston Churchill was appointed prime minister. So again, the fight for democracy involved Franklin Roosevelt, who put people in internment camps and enslaved Americans with conscription, Churchill, who was not elected, and Joseph Stalin, who was not elected. That's who was behind the fight for democracy, which could never be questioned. He initiates bombing in May of 1940. The Germans responded with civilian bombing not till September with the Blitz in 1940. Here is a summary of the discussions that went on in the cabinets by Charles Percy Snow. He gave this lecture at Harvard in 1961 in a paper titled Science and Government. It's actually a collection of speeches. Charles Percy Snow, someone in a position to know, says the paper on bombing went out to top government scientists. It described in quantitative terms the effect on Germany of a British bombing offensive in the next 18 months. The paper claimed that given a total concentration of effort on the production and use of bombing aircraft, it would be possible in all larger towns of Germany, that is those with more than 50,000 inhabitants, to destroy 50% of all the houses. He's not the only source that I have on this. J.M. Spate wrote a book in 1944 before Dresden titled Bombing Vindicated, where he says he was the principal assistant secretary of Air Ministry. He said, retaliation was certain if we carried the war into Germany. Knowing Britain would have to bear the cost, they still provoked a bombing campaign. Yet, because we were doubtful about the psychological effect of propagandist distortion of the truth that it was we who started the strategic offensive, we have shrunk from giving our great decision of May 1940 the publicity which it deserves. That surely was a mistake. It was a splendid decision. It was as heroic as self-sacrificing as Russia's decision to adopt her policy of scorched earth. It could have harmed us morally only if it were equivalent to an admission that we were the first to bomb towns. One final piece of evidence comes from Max Hastings in his book Bomber Command. He uses a ton of primary documents, especially one from a guy named Frederick Lindemann, who was Churchill's right-hand man, a perfect, the epitome of the UK's deep state in the 1940s. So this paper said, in 1938, over 22 million Germans lived in 58 towns of over 100,000 inhabitants, which with modern equipment should be easy to find and hit. Investigation seems to show that having one's house demolished is most damaging to morale. People seem to mind it more than having their friends or even relatives killed. Our
Wow.
calculation assumes, of course, that we really get one half of our bombs into built-up areas. On the other hand, no account is taken of the large promised American production 6,000 heavy bombers in the period in question. So it's just a long explanation as to how are we going to attack the civilian population and destroy morale so much that they end up refusing to obey the National Socialists anymore. So this is more evidence that Winston Churchill was evil because he didn't have the common sense empathy to differentiate between guilty parties, the National Socialists, and the innocent parties, the people of Germany, who living under the Weimar Republic didn't have 20,000 political ideologies to choose from. They had terrible inflation and degeneracy under the Weimar Republic or National Socialism. By the way, every democratic socialist has way more in common with a National Socialist than probably any of us do. So their options were very constrained. So the German civilian population should still be seen as innocent by members of the civilized community.
I mean, like, so you could make the argument that, and I don't want to get into, I really don't want this to become a, like, was Hitler good or bad debate, because I think that's also kind of like, that is definitely not a road I want to go down. But, like, you know, how I kind of perceive this is that, for a lot of people, like, life did become better in Germany under National Socialism, and we can have issues with that all we want, but I think that, you know, there was, like, it did bring back, you know, jobs. It, like, reduced inflation. People were able to get homes. People were able to go on vacations. Art and culture seemed to come back and flourish. And it's kind of one of those things to me that I kind of perceive. Let me know if my perception is wrong about this. Like, tell me, I want you to tell me if I'm wrong. And I know that you will, and I won't be personally offended. And I won't get mad or anything. But, like, my perception of it is there was I mean, I am not suggesting that Hitler was a perfect person at all. I'm not suggesting that some of the things that he did weren't awful and incredibly bad and wrong. What I am saying is that life did improve under Hitler for a lot of people in Germany, and for that, I think there was a lot of love for him. I mean, you can see these rallies that he did where he just had these like massive crowds, just like Trump rallies. Yeah, I mean, I'm not comparing Trump to Hitler, but it was like that kind of like giant spectacle. So people don't do that if they don't love someone. And so the impression that I get with like the bombing campaigns that Churchill elicited against the German people was, in some respects, I agree with you, it was like to deflate morale, to like turn them against their leaders, but it also kind of seems to me to send a message about to this country that's trying to bring up, like, create some sort of like national identity for itself. Like, you will never do this again. If you do this again, there will be consequences for all of you. Am I right about that, or am I totally wrong?
So Churchill actually summarized his intentions for the war and the reason that Germany was basically his obsession from the
Oh,
1930s.
actually, can I stop you right there? Because this is actually perfect with a super chat we got. Because Elena said earlier, when appropriate, can you ask our guest if he has any view on if he believes Churchill went to the Second World War for the reasons we're told? So perfect timing.
Thank you, Elena, for asking that, because motive does matter. Whether you slip and fall and accidentally stab someone, or you conspire to murder them, technically the same thing happens, but the intentions of the actor certainly do matter. And yes, I'm going to answer the Hitler thing. But as far as Churchill's motives go, this is published by Martin Gilbert, the Churchill historian, in a book titled Churchill: A Life. He explains a letter written from Lord Londonderry. Londonderry says to Churchill, "I should like to get out of your mind what appears to be a strong anti-German obsession." Churchill says, "You are mistaken in supposing that I have an anti-German obsession. British policy for 400 years has been to oppose the strongest power in Europe by weaving together a combination of other countries strong enough to face the bully. Sometimes it is Spain, sometimes the French monarchy, sometimes the French Empire, sometimes Germany. I have no doubt who it is now, but if France set up to claim the overlordship of Europe, I shall equally endeavor to oppose them. It is thus through the centuries we have kept our liberties and maintained our life and power." So any country that was a threat to British supremacy, they would have gone to war with, just as they consider themselves a monopolist on the European continent, just as the Union would go to war with the Confederate Southern states before letting them secede and gain power against them. Churchill was not going to let there be a competitor to Britain. That was his motive for picking on Germany in this case. So yeah, a lot of it did have to do with nationalism. But just as the U.S. is vilifying China now that China's gone from mass poverty and starvation under Mao to Deng Xiaoping's socialism with Chinese characteristics, basically their way of having capitalism to a very large extent, which drastically increased the amount of wealth in their society. Now they are a competitor. So even though Richard Nixon was able to go to Beijing and shake hands with Communist Chairman Mao, today it's like, well, we might have to go to war with China if they invade Taiwan. It's the same thing. It's about weakening potential competitors. This was written in a document titled, oh gosh, it was published in 1992 by Paul Wolfowitz and Dick Cheney. It's called Defense Planning Guidance, where they said, look, the Soviets just fell. We are the sole superpower. Our primary objective needs to be making sure no other superpower is going to uh, basically grow to check our power. It's called Defense Planning Guidance 1992. I don't have the exact wording in front of me, but that's why there's this proxy war against Russia to weaken Russia and bleed them dry in Ukraine. That's why Zbigniew Brzezinski armed Mujahideen fighters in Afghanistan from 79 to 89 to fight the Soviet Union. This is called Operation Cyclone. You can look for the details on that from 79 to 89. So this is the policy that they engage in. They don't want any competitors. They are, as I say here, the psychotic boyfriend who would rather see his girlfriend dead than with another man. That literally is what we're facing here. It's not that Churchill saw the crimes of National Socialism. He saw the Holocaust happening. Crimes against Jewry didn't really start until 41, even though Kristallnacht was before then. So it's not like Churchill just tried to have peace And then, unfortunately, the National Socialists made him go to war. Chamberlain was the one who declared war on behalf of Britain. Churchill initiated the terror bombing, and the plan to go to war with any European rival was made with Lord Londonderry as early as 1935. Again, no innocent explanation, so therefore, Winston Churchill is evil.
So I like, and this is why I love talking to you, because I know you're going to have the primary source receipts on this. I know you're going to be able to point to like actual things people said, and so this is like the perspective that I always really appreciate about you, Keith. Nick says gentleman's info is accurate from what I've studied. Thank you, Nick, for that. Naruto says primary source evidence doesn't feed outrage addictions. Hey, ain't that the truth? And I want to encourage anyone, if people have questions for Keith, please feel free to send them in the chat. I am paying attention as I'm just trying to absorb all of this amazing information he's giving us. So, I mean, like, how do you believe that people should perceive Winston Churchill around like World War II? Just like high level, how, like, obviously like, people are multifaceted. I'm sure this was a complicated situation, but how should people look at this if they're grounding into reality?
They should probably look at Winston Churchill as an opportunist who basically, with access to a state apparatus, was able to get away with evil crimes he never would have been able to get away with if there were more of a free market. If people had the freedom to disassociate with actors this bad who were never even elected. You keep bugging me about democracy, and he's not even elected when he's committing all these crimes. Looking at these people as opportunists who we don't have the freedom to disassociate with, that is the lesson. That is, Jeff Bezos, very big, very powerful. Dave Matthews, Taylor Swift, very big and powerful. We can disassociate peacefully with them because they're in much more of a libertarian arrangement with the rest of society. But Winston Churchill, when he's given the blank check of access to a state apparatus, drives the British Empire into the ground. When he first started as First Lord of the Admiralty, the British Empire controlled like 25% of the Earth's land, but then he just kept overexpanding with the First and Second World War, and that's why Britain is no longer an empire. So we should look at Churchill as someone who was an opportunist, who was almost certainly a psychopath. If we're referring to a psychopath as someone with the inability or unwillingness to engage in common sense empathy, that's not what we see with Winston Churchill. Here's more evidence. Charles de Gaulle was the head of the competing French government in France. France and Britain declare war on Germany, September 3rd of 1939. In response, Germany invades France, installs the Vichy government. The opposition government was led by Charles de Gaulle, who was allied with Winston Churchill. Here's what de Gaulle says on page 104 of his book. Among the many people in their desire to emerge from an almost unbearable tension, went so far as to say out loud that they wished the enemy would risk the attack. Foremost among them, Mr. Churchill found the waiting hard to bear. I can still see him at Shakur's one August day, raising his fist toward the sky as he cried, "So they won't come? Are you in such a hurry," I said to him, "to see your towns get smashed to bits?" "You see," he replied, "the bombing of Oxford, Coventry, Canterbury will cause such a wave of indignation in the United States that they'll come into the war." Winston Churchill even supported the bombing of British cities, knowing that that would pull the U.S. into the war. That's how Churchill should be seen. A guy who's so psychotic. He's not only unwilling to differentiate between guilty and innocent people with regard to another nation, he supported killing members of his own tribe, the group he claims to defend. So there is almost nothing admirable about him. He was a great speaker and a very impressive writer. That is a takeaway that we can certainly have, that we can really make sure that we don't blindly follow someone just because they're a very good orator. You got to look at the costs and benefits each time.
That brings to mind something in regards to Israel that is just mind-boggling to me now, and I want to know if like your perception of this and what you have to say about it. Do you know what the Hannibal Directive is?
The Hannibal Directive was authorized on October 7th, and that's
Exactly.
what got the numbers up from a few hundred to 1,200. This is Israel's explicit policy of saying we would rather dead Israeli civilians than having Israeli hostages, which give Hamas more negotiating power. Yes, I am familiar with the Hannibal
Yeah.
Directive,
I,
unfortunately.
I thought that you would be, and I got to tell you, like again, this is one of those things. Like foreign affairs has never really interested me that much, but when I found out about the Hannibal Directive, and I was like, you're telling me that Israel's been going around and Netanyahu's been going around saying 1,200 dead, 1,200 dead, and of course we mourn all dead, and like that's a tragedy, and I don't want to make light of it, but the fact of the matter is, they killed a portion of their own people, including civilians, to prevent them from being taken hostage. And why aren't we screaming about that and saying, you guys, like, I'm sorry, you guys lied to us in order to be able to go in and to I personally think they're eliciting a genocide, or at least trying to get all the Palestinians to leave Gaza so they can. You might disagree with me, and I would love your opinion, but I think they're eliciting a genocide against the Palestinians. I think a lot of those Palestinians are going to end up coming here as refugees, so they're going to become our problem at the end of the day. Whereas if there hadn't been the complete leveling of Gaza based on this lie that was perpetrated by Netanyahu, it's not a complete lie, but it's at least a partial lie, then like a lot of this stuff wouldn't have like the type of support that it does. What do you think?
Well, as far as what is happening in Gaza, whether or not it's a genocide, I don't necessarily use that word because then the argument becomes, what is the definition of genocide? What you
Fair
have
enough.
is a high-tech mass murder campaign where women, children, and male civilians are having to bear the cost of the suffering as a result of Israel's blockade policy of Gaza since 2005, since what the IDF refers to as mowing the lawn, which is where every now and then they go into Gaza and drop a number of bombs and engage in a high-tech massacre against the civilian population to decrease their morale. Same exact thing Churchill did, just to scare the hell out of them. See, they actually block them from having certain foods. They say, we decide what can come in and what can go out. So just to make sure they're not using rockets. The problem is, it's not like there's a no rocket law or they just don't allow Gaza to have a Second Amendment. It's tons of food, tons of construction materials. So, if anyone did this if China blockaded a port in California, they would drop nuclear bombs on Beijing. But Israel does this to Gaza for more than a decade. And these terrorists of Hamas do not have big fighter jets that they could declare war with and then start bombing civilians. So they resort to terrorism. As a matter of fact, other groups that resorted to terrorism were the Irgun, Stern, and Haganah Zionist gangs from 1917 up to May of 1948, when the Zionist state was actually established. The paper to look up on what's happening in Gaza was written in the 1920s by a man named Zeev Jabotinsky. This is the founder of the Irgun terrorist group who wanted to bomb Israel into existence. You engage in a number of terrorist actions, and that scares the civilian population away, so you could bring in Jewish immigrants to set up a Zionist state, as dreamed up by Theodor Herzl in his book, The Jewish State. Zeev Jabotinsky says, the one thing we want is the one thing the Arabs don't want, and that's Jewish immigration. So how were they going to engage in such a fantastic feat? One, to empty the Arab population. They engage in a number of acts of terrorism. You can look up things like the Lavon affair, which did take place after 1948, but the crimes of Irgun, Stern, and Haganah, which eventually became the Israeli Defense Forces. It's not like they just got a country and then found a military. It was just these terrorist groups who were then given the stamp of approval of an official state. Jabotinsky says, basically, in a document titled The Iron Wall, the only way we're going to get these people to give up their land is to bomb ourselves into existence, to create an iron wall which they cannot resist. Even the most uncivilized tribes of the past, even when the newcomers were bringing great technological innovations, never gave up their father's homeland. So we're basically going to have to ask them to leave, and when they don't, we're going to have to resort to the acts of terrorism, which Irgun, Stern, and Haganah eventually did engage in. So, side note, population replacement generally seems to be the Democrats' theory as to how to gain power in the United States by bringing in Haitians, Venezuelans, and Somalians. So this is a very common tactic. Stalin did the same thing in Estonia, flooded the place with Russian immigrants to change the balance of power. So it's very popular. It's not a conspiracy theory. This is a state weapon that it uses against the civilian population when it can't convince it to change its mind. more or less. So what's happening in Gaza was explained 100 years ago by Zev Jabotinsky in The Iron Wall. They want to scare them and bomb them out of the place just so they can go elsewhere in order for the Zionists to have a monopolist state of their own. It was really all laid out all back then. That is what's happening now. It has nothing to do with democracy. Of course, Israel controls the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River, and no Palestinian in the West Bank or Gaza has the right to vote or anything. They're constantly killed. They live under martial law. So it's just ridiculous that to say Netanyahu, good guy, like Churchill, Hamas, bad guy, like Adolf Hitler. That is some sort of connection that we can find between the present and the past with the Israeli conflict.
Yeah, I mean, it's been absolutely mind-boggling to me to watch, honestly, like the conservative kind of it's like all of a sudden all these people who claim to be anti-war under Trump instantly became neocons again once Israel became involved. And it was mind-boggling to me to watch like the reaction, especially when Netanyahu came and spoke in front of Congress. And I'm sure you watched that speech, but I was going, Netanyahu is flat out saying, hey guys, you want to go to war with Iran on our behalf? Let's go to war with Iran. Who wants to go to war with Iran? And then Donald Trump comes out and he starts saying, if I get assassinated, Iran did it. And I'm like, you asshole, like what? And then like the very first interview that JD Vance gave after he got nominated for vice president, he said, we need to use the big bombs on Iran, not the little bombs on Iran. And I'm like, you guys were anti-war like 2 seconds ago. What happened? Well, Israel happened. What do you think?
The pro-life, pro-family position is anti-war. The fact that when God says thou shalt not murder, there wasn't some asterisk. Well, unless you're part of a group that wears camouflage and you're called the military. That is my message to the right. They keep throwing more lies out here with, well, Iran. Netanyahu in that speech said, for all we know, Iran is funding the protesters outside now. It's like, well, I don't know. Every time I log into X, a Palestinian has his limbs blown off and his face is melted off. Maybe that could arouse their suspicions. Well, no, maybe it's just Iran. That would never upset anyone. So it's just ridiculous. Netanyahu spoke in front of Congress, I want to say in 2002, to Dennis Kucinich, and Dennis Kucinich built him a broken bridge to retreat across. And he said, Mr. Netanyahu, now Netanyahu has been the prime minister of Israel on and off since 1996. And Putin's a threat to democracy, whatever.
Wow.
Okay.
I didn't realize that.
So Kucinich says, Mr. Regional Expert Netanyahu, are there any other countries besides Iraq which we should go to war over and engage in regime change? He goes, well, as I said, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, that is certainly one. Muammar Gaddafi in Libya is another, which the U.S. ended up going to war against. He also mentions the regime in Syria, who he says is catering they're allied with Hezbollah in Lebanon from the regime in Syria. So this ended up being a war in Syria where the U.S. fought against Bashar al-Assad's regime. Barack Obama came out and said, Assad has used tear gas against innocent civilians. He's a dictator. He's no longer fit for office. Of course, we all know what ended up happening to Muammar Gaddafi. He was killed in that video. And then, slave markets ended up running through Libya. So basically what Israel is doing is using the U.S. to take out all its competitors in the region. And the U.S. has to bear the cost of all these military conflicts, as do the people of Israel. They're not exactly sitting high because of it, but it's a few politicians who benefit at the expense of everyone else. Now, in Syria, to go to war against Assad, they couldn't just go to door and ask people, can you take some time off work and come fight this war? What they did was they looked for militant fighters who were already fighters willing to kill. The group that was willing to do this is Jabhat al-Nusra, who pledged their allegiance to Abu Muhammad al-Jaladi. This is Al-Qaeda in Syria. They didn't break away from Al-Qaeda until 2016. So the U.S. government, it's called Operation Timber Sycamore, on behalf of Israel, was funding Al-Qaeda to fight the Bashar al-Assad regime in Israel. So that is what we're up against. It's not just like for no reason, we just pick on Israel. Certainly, according to Philip Zelikow, who was head of the 9/11 Commission, he said that it doesn't really make much sense why the U.S. would want to go to war with Iraq. Israel, on the other hand, Iraq is Israel's biggest competitor in the region, so that would really make sense. It certainly seems like Israel is calling the shots with regard to all this. However, we can't take agency away from the American politicians who lie us into these wars, Rumsfeld, Cheney, Wolfowitz, George W. Bush, as well as the soldiers who sign up and do not refuse orders when they're given to them. So yes, that is the problem with Israel and the U.S. blind allegiance and blank check that they've given to Israel for heaven knows how long.
What role do you think AIPAC plays in all of this?
AIPAC is the Jewish guilt mother who constantly goes around saying, "Oh, you're not funding a campaign to murder innocent people. That's really nice. I hope
Oy
there's
vey."
not a hell." I don't know too much about the specifics of AIPAC. The most persuasive case that AIPAC is extraordinarily influential in U.S. politics is a book titled "The Israeli Lobby and Foreign Policy" by Stephen Walt and John J. Mearsheimer. Mearsheimer is an absolute hero on the Ukraine issue. So it's generally recognized that the American Israeli Political Action Committee is extremely influential in American politics, both for Democrats and Republicans. That's why you see so much alignment with what Israel tends to want. The U.S. Ends up going along with. Since Harry Truman recognized the Zionist state, it looks like they've had a very significant influence in American politics. I don't know any more specifics about a lot of things, but that is the general consensus, widely accepted among any people who have researched it. It's like, well, AIPAC's extremely powerful. And you can look at how hysterical they get when one guy, Thomas Massie, says, "I'm not hanging out with you. You're a foreign lobby organization." It doesn't really matter to me, the fact that whether they're foreign or domestic. If they were making really good points and they were foreign, I'd say, well, let's welcome them. But it's the fact that they're trying to provoke us into a war to fight Israel's wars on their behalf. So, yeah, AIPAC is generally one of the biggest marketing forces in America for Israel. But watch out for Russian interference.
Yeah, well, exactly. And you know, I mean, that's generally like the impression I have about like AIPAC as well. And I'll just like co-sign this idea of like the absolute hysteria anytime anyone says something that is against AIPAC. I mean, the reaction to Thomas Massie saying that basically every politician in Washington D.C. has an AIPAC lobbyist on speed dial, and just like the absolute hysteria that happens anytime anyone questions anything that Benjamin Netanyahu does on the conservative right. You're instantly like labeled as an anti-Semite. And now they're calling everyone the woke right if they dare to, you know, talk about like the things you're talking about with Churchill and World War II and all this stuff. It really, it's amazing to watch. And I really do feel like, you know, October 7th to me, it was one of those moments where you could see, I felt like I could see a lot of people in a whole new light, where all of a sudden a lot of people were calling for censorship of ideas that they did not agree with, calling for the arrests of students that were just sitting on a lawn protesting. I mean, the college protests did not start out with taking over the buildings. The college protests, and I know this because I was watching them like just from like live coverage on the ground from the beginning. The college protests started out, well, it was an escalation that had been happening since October 7th. They didn't spring up out of nowhere, but they started out as students literally sitting around on a lawn at a school where they quite frankly pay tuition. And then all of a sudden they're having the NYPD called out on them and they're sitting on a lawn. And it's like, you know, like maybe that's a little excessive. Like we do still have the First Amendment in this country. Maybe we should, you know, respect the right of people to protest and express ideas without calling the cops on them all the time when they're not doing anything wrong. They're not hurting anything. They're just saying ideas you don't like. And also there's the absolute backlash on social media. Anytime someone says something that might be considered against Benjamin Netanyahu or what the government of Israel is doing, the backlash is severe, and it's more severe than anything that I've ever seen come from the left, quite frankly. What do you think?
Yeah, it has just been amazing because I went to state schools from elementary school to middle school, high school, and then I went to Arizona State University before getting kicked out. And yep, hey, if they want to give me that honorary PhD, I'd be happy to submit the ultimate case against the Churchill cult for my PhD thesis. What really is amazing is that the constant vilification of whites that was very evident from elementary school through college about how whites are uniquely imperialist, whites engaged in slavery, whites engaged in Jim Crow, all these terrible things. It was never really met with, hey, you can't be talking about a group like that. But after about a week of protests against Zionism and some people specifying Judaism, Zionism is the plan for a Jewish monopolist state in Palestine. Judaism, you're just referring to a race of people.
Right.
It's not really a religion because you can get like a 23andMe and see if you're Jewish. It's not going to determine if you're Protestant or Catholic because
Right.
those are religions. Judaism, I'm referring to a religion. So finally, their religion starts getting some heat, which I think is totally unjust. I'm against all these arbitrary divides. I really try and divide people from smart versus ignorant and violent versus voluntarist as much as I can. Um, Finally, they get a little heat and they absolutely flip out when the majority population was relentlessly vilified nonstop, not just by other students, by the professors who grade your papers. There wasn't really much resistance. There weren't massive calls from Nikki Haley to strip these organizations of their federal funding. It was, yeah, bash whites all you want for decades on end. Even though the concept of slavery, you can read the Code of Hammurabi, did not exactly originate in 1916, as Hannah Nicole Jones would like us to believe. It actually goes back thousands of years to the Middle East because
Yeah.
anytime anyone had a blank check or the ability to exert massive amounts of force against another person for their own personal benefit, they took that liberty. Unfortunately, it's very sad to say. All humans across all time. So when the idiots say the lesson of history is don't be racist because that could lead to slavery, the vast majority of slavery existed before ships existed for you to go see other races in different parts of the planet. So it's so pathetic that they've gotten so accustomed to swimming with the tide. When the tide pushes against them a little, they get into absolute hysterics. So yes, the right-wing snowflakery with regard to questioning the Zionist regime, I just think is pathetic. There's nothing wrong with hating Zionism or really any state operation. Of course, I'm against hating people because they're Jewish or any aspect of their race. But Zionism, to call Zionism Judaism, is just absolutely sick and pathetic. And I can't believe they call the plan to violently establish a monopoly state is the same as being born a certain race. That is just shocking that AIPAC and the Ben Shapiros of the world have convinced people and the Dennis Pragers that is the case. It's just pathetic. Just admit you're wrong. I will admire you guys more if you say, you know, I'm right about everything except this one thing. Shouldn't have had double standards for whites and Jews when it comes to vilifying people.
Yeah. I mean, I said the same thing over and over again. I was like, because again, like a lot of these far left groups that have been involved in the college protests, I was following them way before like October 7th. I've been tracking them for a long time. And it's like, the narrative from the conservative right, this is all anti-Jewish, they're all anti-Semites, they're all pro-Hamas terrorists. I'm like, that's not what's going on at all. First of all, there are Jewish organizations involved in the campus protests. Jewish Voices for Peace is one of the chief organizing organizations in the protests, and they're a far left group, and I disagree with them on a lot, but you cannot tell me that they're anti-Jewish when they are in fact Jewish. You can also look at, if you look at footage that was like on the ground at the campus protests, they were having Shabbat dinners. They had rabbis come and talk to them. There were a lot of Jewish students involved. They did press conferences with Jewish students where they were flat out saying, this has nothing to do with being Jewish. This has to do with the Israeli government. And a lot of these organizations on the campuses, they existed. The boycott, divest, sanction movement has existed forever on college campuses. This is not a new thing. And a lot of these protests were just extensions of the BDS protests that had already been happening anyway. But no, it's like they ran with this narrative that it was all anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish. And it's like, if you actually looked at what was happening, it's not about that at all. These are far left protests. And I fundamentally believe that some of them are genuinely concerned about the Palestinian issue. A lot of them, though, they're just Marxists that are using this as a way to advance their political ideology in the United States. I've had communists on my channel come and say that Intifada means worldwide socialist revolution. That's what they mean when they say Intifada. It's not about killing all the Jews or anything like that. And it's just like, again, all this primary source evidence exists out there, and it's like no one is looking at it.
Well, it's very easy because if the communists say free Palestine, it's like, okay, say Israel's wiped off the map tomorrow by Iran. Would Hamas usher in the free society of egalitarianism and homosexual equality that you
No.
guys want? Is that in their platform? Is that in their Declaration of Rights? It's like, no. Well, then why are you calling it free so long as the Zionist state isn't there? Because it's literally just a propaganda tool. Of course, they have no real connection to it. Mark Weber went on to, he's a historian who went on, I think, the Montel Williams show. And he's the one who said, why is it that we hear about the 6 million so much and not the 20 million? Because when you say the 20 million, people seldom know who you're talking about. The 20 million is a number from Encyclopedia Britannica claiming that is the number of Chinese people who were killed by the Japanese regime of Emperor Hirohito, which was evil, but of course that doesn't justify Hiroshima or anything. In fact, taking down the Japanese regime who was colonizing Vietnam and Korea led to the US inheriting conflicts in Vietnam and Korea. So I'm not justifying going to war with Japan. However, why don't the 20 million victims of China get brought up as much? The reason is because it's just not profitable for the overall narrative. What these neocons hate about, and progressives also hate about this aspect of questioning Churchill, they could always call Churchill an imperialist who mistreated Gandhi and the people of India. Calling out Churchill for his crimes against the German civilian population is to say, well, this narrative of history is just a bunch of white supremacy. There's a lot of mass white death that we'd have to ignore to say it was whites versus everyone. There were mass white deaths in the American Civil War, the English Civil War. The First World War was about 9 million white deaths. The Second World War, millions of more white deaths. It's a little harder for them to say America was a blatantly white supremacist society and there was a patriarchy. Well, you can do this research on your own, but only one of the genders was ever conscripted for the military in American history. I won't say which gender it is. You can check the selectiveservice.gov website to find out, but it's not the gender you might think it is if you hear from the progressives that all of American history is just racist patriarchy. It was people who used the state apparatus to their advantage when there was no check and balance that there is in the free market. When people are written these blank checks and they're given state power, they're either evil because that's who's attracted to such power, or they engage in an action which raises their social status and then later rationalize whatever they were going to do afterwards.
Yeah, I want to run something by you, and this is a really specific reference, so you might not have thoughts on it yet, and I'm happy to send you the actual clip of this after the show if you want more information. But like this whole thing is just like bringing to mind to me something I watched on the channel. It was right after October 7th. I want to say it was maybe like in November of last year or something, and it was a lecture that was given at, I believe, University of California at Berkeley by a professor of Jewish studies out of UC Santa Cruz, and I don't recall his name off the top of my head, but it's definitely within the University of California system. And basically so what's been going on is that the left is trying to change the definition of anti-Semitism in different ways that I think is it's just a new, like they always play with these, like they play these language games, right? One of the ways in which they're trying to change the definition of anti-Semitism, and I think you might get a kick out of this, is they're saying that you can't be anti-Semitic towards Jewish people who have a lot of money and power because they're pissed off at Bill Ackman for like going after them, and so they're saying that you can't be anti-Semitic towards Bill Ackman because he has all the power and all the money, so they're trying to change it in that way. But this one professor in the University of California system, he flat out said that if you oppose the immigration of black and brown people into the United States, even if those people are not Jewish, that is still anti-Semitism. What do you make of that?
So this would be a general theory that the Jewish population, being a world minority, is a minority in every country except Israel. So any ethnic cohesion, any single dominant racial group within a geographical area, France, England, Russia, Germany, America, that is a threat to their survival as a group. Therefore, what you need are large amounts of other groups to come in, so no one group has so much power that they could engage in the pogroms that the Russians did, or the Kristallnachts and Holocausts that the Germans did in Poland. So that is why he's saying that it's anti-Semitic, because when the Jews are a distinct minority against a very clear majority, they're very likely to get their rights trampled on. But if there are many competing groups where there's no single white majority, then they feel more safe. They feel safe in massive diversity, and they feel unsafe in very heterogeneous societies. This, of course, is bullshit, because
Yeah.
the wealthiest Jews on planet Earth did very well in America when it was a much more white country than when it's becoming more diverse. So please know, I was just explaining a theory that some Jews benefit from at the expense of everyone else, just as some whites, less than 1% of whites, benefited from slavery. Less than 1% of whites really benefited from the invasion of Iraq. It's not like America benefited. Some people in America, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, Halliburton, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, they benefit at the expense of the larger population. So when I point to Netanyahu getting very elevated in monetary wealth and social status from the crimes of Israel, I'm not saying this is what they Jews do. I'm saying some people within that demographic exploit the rest of the demographic so they could reap benefits at the expense of everyone else. That's the logic of the professor's statement.
I appreciate that explanation. Nurtu says, did you see Tucker Carlson recently said the Haitians aren't eating pets; they're being ritualistically sacrificed by people engaging in witchcraft? That's interesting. What do you make of that, Keith?
So he said this in his opening monologue with a meeting he had with Charlie Kirk to an audience. I have not seen this. However, I wonder what the dominant religion is in Haiti. And we know that witchcraft is certainly practiced,
Yeah.
probably in San Francisco by those people at the Bohemian Grove every July when they're worshiping that owl. Um, I don't know the details on the likelihood of Haitians engaging in witchcraft, to what extent they take it so seriously that they eat cats. I'm sure it is a thing, though. That is absolutely devastating.
I'm sincerely disturbed by the amount of videos that I've had to see on my timeline of people barbecuing cats in the past couple days. Like it really is disturbing.
And
I'm like, can you
dogs.
and dogs? I'm like, can you guys just stop posting this stuff? It's like the same thing. I'm gonna go on a little bit of a tangent here. It's like the same thing when conservatives post literal gay porn on Twitter, where I have to see penises and peeing and all this stuff, and I'm like, I was not emotionally prepared for this. I don't want to see gay porn on my Twitter. Can you guys please stop? And they're like, no, you have to look at this. I'm like, no, I don't. I'm sorry. Like, no, just stop. Mac B says the right engages in linguistics like the left. Yes, they do. LK says his Estonian facts on importing Soviets is 100%. Thank you, LK. And then Kate says here, war is young men dying and old men talking. Is it true the voice actor for Winnie the Pooh did Churchill's speeches because Churchill was too drunk?
That is something that was popularized in a book titled "Facts You Didn't Know About History," and his name is Norman. I forget his last name. That is something I've heard. That is not anything that I've really looked into. It's important to know. I waited until Churchill wrote this down, put it in a book, sent it to a publisher, and then I put it there. So maybe some of his speeches were not exactly him talking, but either way, you should come out and clarify if someone else is doing the talking for you. I'm not sure if it was the Winnie the Pooh guy, but that's why I try to hang him with his own words in his own books.
Yeah, which I think is always the smartest way to do it. Nick says Reagan said that professor of Jewish studies is Dorian Bell. That article and that video clip is on my Substack, guys. If you want to see that clip where they're talking about if you oppose black and brown immigration from the southern border, even if they're not Jewish, then it's anti-Semitic. So I do have that archived on the Substack for you. So Keith, like, where do you see all this going? How does this play out? Because I'm kind of in a position right now where I'm in a state of I don't care, because I kind of feel like if Kamala gets elected president, we're going to war with Iran. If Trump gets elected president, we're going to war with Iran. Am I wrong? Is there any hope? Like,
So the biggest amount of hope, it seems like Iran would be the most likely, just because they don't have the nuclear arsenal that China or Russia has, and because they are in the crosshairs of Israel, and Israel's very influential in American politics. So Iran, unfortunately, is the biggest one, the one that's most likely to take place. The best news that we have is on November 15th of 2022, there was a bomb that went off in Poland and killed 2 civilians. Vladimir Zelensky came out and said, Russia has bombed Poland. NATO must respond. To which the Pentagon didn't really have much of a statement for a few hours, and it was shocking. Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense is his title, I believe, came out and said, upon further investigation, it looks like this was, in fact, a Ukrainian defense missile, but ultimately Putin is still at fault, And we're looking into the matter further because Putin's aggression has really caused this conflict, which made Ukraine bomb, and it went in the wrong direction. So that's the issue. Now, it's worth noting that they didn't just run along with Zelensky and say, "Yep, Russia's now bombed Poland. Poland is a NATO ally. We're declaring Article 5 and going to war with Russia." What they want, they really just want to enslave you. But if you resist enslavement, then they'll engage in murder. It's not that murder is at the top of their list, but it's something they're willing to do if people don't succumb. So there are certain moments where it's like, look, we don't really want war with Russia. We just want to really, really weaken Russia. So it could be the case. They don't really want war with Iran. They just want to sanction them to death, please the Israelis. They know that they lost a 20-year war in Afghanistan to the Taliban. That was NATO's first ever declaration of war, was in September or October of 2001. And after 20 years, tens of thousands of civilian lives, thousands of American soldiers, trillions of dollars, the Taliban took over Kabul in 11 days. And they think going to war with Iran, who has 80 million people in their civilian population, a geographical area much bigger than Afghanistan, that's who they want to go to war with. The war in Iraq led to the rise of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria and the empowerment and expansion of Iranian influence in the area, the Shia influence in the area. So look, they have to know behind closed doors. They're like, unless we're willing to drop our entire nuclear arsenal on a country, we're going to lose a war. So we just have to create these boogeymen to get the people scared, so they're willing to give up their freedom, so they don't engage in tax resistance, so they obey the regulations and see us as the general savior. It's a very good scam we got going. We would hate to overexpand, just as the British Empire did, overexpand like Napoleon's empire did. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was the empire to start the First World War. They lost 1 million people, and their empire was non-existent within a decade. So they know there are costs to going to massive conflicts, and the soldiers just don't have the allegiance to the ruling class that they did maybe in the 90s or something. So I think it's not necessarily that profitable for them to go to war. However, it still is a way that they could really unify Americans. George Bush, after September 11th, had a 91% approval rating. Very well could be that that's what Biden, Kamala, or Trump end up looking for as a way to unify the population, unfortunately.
Who do you trust these days for sources of information? Because I gotta tell you, like after October 7th, it kind of became all bets are off, and I stopped trusting basically anyone. So who do you read that you're like, these are my go-to sources for information about like what is actually happening?
So, as managing editor of the Libertarian Institute,
Obviously.
other people do most of the writing, and I look through links there. What I try to do is go as close to the primary documents as I can. You look at a situation, say October 7th. You look at who was involved, all right, Hamas and the IDF. So immediately you look at the Hamas media office, and you can read a document titled Operation Al-Aqsa Flood. And that is the Hamas explanation of what happened and why. You then can look at Haaretz and the Time of Israel, which after October 7th said the IDF embraced the Hannibal Doctrine. You can also look at the Times of Israel saying that Netanyahu's plan to support Hamas and make it so the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was previously under Arafat, it's now referred to as Fatah. He wanted to weaken them. So what he did was he had a plan with both parties in the Israeli parliament to allocate funds for Hamas in order to bolster their social status within the region so they could have no partner for peace. A collection of quotes. It's not just he didn't stop them from accessing funds. There was an explicit plan where the head of Mossad went to Qatar to make sure that funds were authorized to go to Hamas. The plan is so Naftali Bennett and Benjamin Netanyahu can say, look, we don't have a partner for peace. We want to give the Palestinians their state. We can't. What do you want us to negotiate with Hamas, a bunch of terrorists? So that's unfortunate. So when October 7th happens, you look at Hamas, find what they say about the situation, and find what the Times of Israel and Haaretz are saying about the situation. You also want to look at people who have a very good track record on the issue. This includes Scott Horton, the director of the Libertarian Institute, with his book, Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism, where he gets into history of Israel. people like Jeremy R. Hammond, who wrote a book, Obstacle to Peace, people like Sheldon Richman, who wrote Coming to Palestine. These are people who've developed a very good reputation when it comes to using primary sources to make their case for the fact that the Israel-Palestine conflict, again, is not good country versus bad, small concentration camp or whatever you want to call Gaza. It certainly is not a state that has a monopoly that they could actually enforce in this area. So you want to look at the situation, look at primary sources, and look what people with good reputations about this situation has said in the past. So looking at places like even the Wall Street Journal, or just earlier when I quoted the New York Times, you will find articles from mainstream outlets. So you have to say, what is their real incentive here in publishing this? And when you have something like what I cited with Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, they do not really have an incentive to lie. The incentive really matters. If O.J. Simpson had come out before he died and said, I didn't kill my wife, that would not be big news. But if he said, I killed my wife, well, he has an incentive to say he didn't. So this is something that should pique our interest. So when establishment sources say things that are in opposition to what the deep state and AIPAC really want us to think, then we could see that someone really is motivated by an attempt to get the truth out. Get as close to primary sources as you can. Always make sure you're reading multiple sides of the equation. That includes, if people want to know about the Second World War, there's a book titled Collection of Speeches, 1922 to 1945, and it's Hitler's speeches at that time. So you want to go and look at what was he saying in 1933 when he got elected? What was he saying when he went into Poland in 39? What was he saying in 35 when he remilitarized the Rhineland? What was he saying in his last days, knowing that the Bolsheviks are just miles away from seizing Berlin? This is how you get an accurate understanding of what's happening.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And that's actually something we're going to do, because now there are all these like AI reconstructions of Hitler's speeches. And again, I'm not saying that Hitler was like a good person or like anything like that. What I am saying is that the man made public statements that are reflective of what he was thinking at the time, and whether or not those public statements are true is a different thing, but we can learn about why he did what he did and kind of like, again, hinge back into reality. Because even with Hitler, I feel like there's been things that are distorted when it comes to like the myth around World War II, where he has to be the ultimate like most evil thing that ever existed. And I'm not saying he was good. Again, I'm not saying he was good, but there's more to the story than just this one-dimensional perspective on it. And there was, I think, like an arc of this. And so that is something that we're going to be watching on my Rumble channel, because I'm not doing that on YouTube. But there have been all these like AI recreations of his speeches now, where they're doing it in English and you can actually see him giving it. And it leaves, honestly, like a much different impression than if you see it in German, because German is a bit of a harsh language sometimes. And I think it sounds angrier sometimes than he actually was, although he certainly was a very passionate speaker on many occasions.
So two final things about why we should be skeptical of the allied countries' politicians as well as the Axis. Colonel Carla Carlson's research at the Canadian Forces College estimates that 600,000 German men, women, and children died as a result of the direct bombing campaign of German cities during the war from 39 to 45. Many thousands more were wounded and mutilated. Millions more were left homeless. In the prosecution of the bombing campaign, the British Commonwealth lost 55,000 aircrew, 18% of which were Canadian. So 600,000 deaths. You better have such a good case that these deaths should have happened. We're totally right to be mad about the 40,000 dead Palestinians, and I get that it's a bigger proportion of the certain of Gaza. 2 million, I think, is their general population. 600,000 people were supposed to just blindly say this was just an inherently good thing. Churchill had exhausted every single alternative and couldn't stop going to war. If you watch Hitler's speeches, he's one of the greatest speakers you'll ever hear, first of all. And in one of the speeches, he says, if something should happen to me in this military conflict, my second in command is Göring and my third in command is Rudolf Hess. Now, imagine Winston Churchill allocated all these resources to just conspiring to murder Adolf Hitler. I don't know how things would have turned out differently, but say he did that and he murdered Adolf Hitler. It's not like Göring or Hess ever could have mobilized the German people in the way that Hitler
Right.
did. He really was extremely unique in the same way Vladimir Lenin is extremely unique with his brilliance and his ability to communicate effectively. Again, these are evil people. The question is what would happen if they were taken out? I don't think Germany could have committed the atrocities or engaged in unnecessary expansion. Maybe they could have fought the Soviets, but not engaged in crimes in Warsaw and Rotterdam and London that they ended up doing. So there is an alternative, which is they could have gone after the one guy who was actually guilty of these crimes. But 600,000, 9/11 was 3,000, and we just mourned the 23rd year anniversary of it, and it was a tragedy. We're talking about 600,000 people, a lot of whom, let's say 99%, had nothing to do with orchestrating the crimes of the National Socialist regime. One more quote, just about the Allies in general. Here is former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. He was the Secretary of Defense during Vietnam, but in the Second World War, he worked under Curtis LeMay, and he was keeping statistics about the U.S. bombing campaign in Japan. McNamara says in a documentary titled The Fog of War, proportionality should be a guideline in war. Killing 50% to 90% of the people of 67 Japanese cities and then bombing them with 2 nuclear bombs is not proportional in the minds of some people to the objectives we were trying to achieve. You're not going to really convince yourself if you look at this information that there were good countries and bad countries. The only consistent thesis is the pro-life, pro-freedom, pro-family position that the people in countries generally are good. The psychopaths have every incentive to seize the power of the state, and we could say all the politicians on all sides were evil, and the conscripted soldiers and dead civilians are the one who really deserve our empathy. And that's why we should oppose mass murder campaigns in the future, because that's an actual lesson we can extract from these atrocities in the past.
I appreciate that. One last question from my Dragon Balls. If China went to war with Taiwan today, would the U.S. really stand up for the island? How much is rhetorical smoke versus actual fire? It seems the odds would not be in our and the Allies' favor.
That is a very good question because it gets to the difference between the rhetoric, which they use to inflame the passions of their constituents, versus what would actually go down. I think the U.S. would respond militarily. This is Joe Biden's position on 60 Minutes, and it was never clarified by the Director of National Intelligence. Biden was explicitly asked on 60 Minutes. So unlike Ukraine, where we're just sending assistance and some volunteers are going, but not at the direction of the president, you're saying U.S. troops would fight on behalf of Taiwan against the government of China. Joe Biden says, well, that's what we signed on to. And the interviewer asked him for clarification. So you would send U.S. troops? And Biden says, yes. So that is the official position. They very well might do it. Or they could just say China stages a coup and now Taiwan is completely under the control of China. If the claim is we don't want them to have access to semiconductors, why don't we just keep trading with China like we already trade with them billions of dollars a year? Or, sorry, microchip investors, you're going to have to build your new facility in Texas or Arizona. Intel came to Arizona when they didn't like the deal that they were getting wherever they came from. So there are very low cost, easy alternatives to peace, which is decriminalize all capitalist acts between consenting adults in America, and we would have an economy that China could never compete with. But they don't have that incentive. They have the incentive to go to war. I am afraid that because they really see China as the ultimate competitor, that they would go to war with China and threaten nuclear weapons to be used, because it's just such a threat to their ego, the concept that there's a bigger kid on the block. This would be the justification. They're already playing with matches with regard to giving using NATO fighter pilots to go into Moscow to fight on behalf of Zelensky's regime.
Man.
So Taiwan is definitely one that I'm really scared of, and it's completely unjustifiable that J.D. Vance is a hawk on this issue when he should just say, you know what, I don't like when we employ people in other countries while there's poverty in America. We're going to abolish all commercial regulation and incentivize everyone to invest in America. That's what's going to create jobs. That's what gives consumers more options. That's what increases the supply of chips. That's what lowers the cost of these items, so more people can have access to them at lower income levels. That the free market really is a great what you could call bulwark against the reality of mass warfare, because it's cheaper to trade with people than to go conquer them when you're creating enemies, and you might get shot at and killed, and your family might also have to suffer. China's one I'm really afraid of. But there's nothing like what the neocons tell us. Our hands are tied. We have to go to war. There's no other option. There is another option that doesn't really involve the military at all. Decriminalize all capitalist acts between consenting adults so our economy cannot be competed with.
Man. Keith Knight, thank you so much again for coming on the channel. Guys, just in case you missed it, I want to just point you to Keith's awesome article over on the Libertarian Institute, which is definitely a source you guys should keep and pay attention to. I put that link in the chat. This is the ultimate case against the Churchill cult, which he has just published, which has all the facts that you can, all the primary sources that he's been citing throughout this thing. And this is one of the reasons I love talking to Keith, because he brings the primary sources and he's so knowledgeable about all this stuff, and I really appreciate it. You can also follow him on Twitter at @An_capitalist, and I highly recommend you do. I just think he's one of the most intelligent people out there commenting on this stuff right now. Always brings a great kind of even keel perspective to it, which I really appreciate. Keith, thank you so much again for coming on the channel.
I have one gift for the audience. If you want this book, Domestic Imperialism, 9 Reasons I Left Progressivism, go to libertarianinstitute.org, look in the book section for Domestic Imperialism, and you'll get a free PDF of the entire book. This is 15 years of research in a very, very thin, easy to read book.
Oh, we love that. Like good meaty research, but easy to read and not that much to read. So I love that. So guys, again, that's libertarianinstitute.org. Thank you for coming out today, Keith. Certainly you're welcome back on the channel anytime and would love to have you. And guys, just so you know, we're going to be wrapping up the stream now, but we do have a community Zoom call coming up in a little bit. We do community Zoom calls every Monday at 7 p.m. and we do them on Wednesdays at noon. And how you get invited to my community Zoom call is you head over to my Substack, which is Carlyn, KARLYN.substack.com. You can listen to the new podcast I've put up saying basically, James Lindsay, it's time to put up or shut up and debate me. You can read the very specific grievances that I have with James. If you don't want that drama, hey, check out the Unwoke Zine project, because last week we did a great 2-hour workshop where we taught you how to make basically unwoke propaganda, and it was awesome and it was amazing. That's completely free, available now on the Substack. And of course, one of the best resources, if you are new to my work and you want to get introduced to the radical far left, head over to the Substack, click on How to Speak Socialist at the top, and access the 4-hour on-demand crash course where I will bring you through dozens of clips from radical far leftist trainings to show you what the left is saying, to break down the language, to explain it. There is no one else with this type of content on the internet, and it is completely free for you guys. Please watch it, please share it, and I will be back tomorrow for another stream at 5 p.m. Take care, guys. Thank you for coming out. We'll see you soon. Bye.